Hi, folks. It's Ken Cook, and today I'm having another episode all about energy policy. In order for me to understand this topic fully, I'm speaking with two powerhouse guests. Mark Jacobson is a brilliant educator and writer. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University and is the director of its Atmosphere and Energy program. He's also the co-founder of the nonprofit Solutions Project. He's written 6 books, the latest of which, No Miracles Needed: How Today's Technology Can Save Our Climate and Clean Our Air, is a must-read for anyone interested in a clean energy future. Mark has won a plethora of awards for his unwavering dedication to finding large-scale climate solutions, and he's the go-to expert in the environmental and sustainable energy community for all manner of policy issues. Our second guest, Greg Jaczko, is an internationally recognized expert on energy policy, a physicist, and the author of Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. That's because he's the former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Greg is an outspoken advocate of clean energy alternatives to nuclear power, and he's a proponent of governmental transparency. He's also a longtime personal friend and mentor to me on all things nuclear energy and energy policy generally. It would be a disservice to delay you any further from hearing from these two exceptional people, so let's jump in. Hi, I'm Ken Cook, and one of the things that causes me to have episodes is energy policy. And I am thrilled today to have two people on the show who fit together beautifully in a discussion of energy policy that can bring all the listeners out there right up to the front lines of the debate. My first guest is Mark Jacobson. I think of Mark as an architect, a principal architect of the renewable energy economy that we are trying to build, struggling to build, and we'll talk about that struggle as we go forward. Mark's book, latest book of 6 or 7, I lose track, but this is one you have to get and you have to read. This is the book that will guide you through energy policy, the energy debate, the forms of energy that we want to phase out, the forms of energy we want to phase in, and why and how we can do it. And it's called No Miracles Needed. Well, maybe a political miracle or two. We'll get back to that. How today's technology can save our climate and clean our air. And that clean our air part, which is one of Mark's real specialties to focus on, is often left out. My other guest is a friend of 20 plus years, Greg Jaczko. We have been in the trenches together, Greg, since the Yucca Mountain battles in the early 2000s when you worked for Senator Reid. So if Mark is an architect, Greg has been literally in the pressure vessel of federal energy policymaking. These are two real experts who can help us navigate our way through some of the toughest questions that face us. And both of these folks have expertise to address those questions, whether they agree with me or not. So, Mark, Greg, thank you for coming on the program. Mark, I'm going to start with you. So the reason everyone needs to buy No Miracles Needed is not just that it's a text that covers all of the issues we'll be talking about today, but the way he fits it together. It is a reference book for me. When I find myself trying to remember arguments around a specific aspect of energy policy, the benefits of a certain technology, the downsides, Mark's book is the one I go to. So, Mark, you have been at the center of the energy policy debate because of the power of your intellect and the work ethic to put ideas out there that really, to me, look like blueprints for how we get to a clean energy future. So sketch out to me the basic thesis behind No Miracles Needed. Because sometimes I find myself praying for them, and maybe I just need to change my strategy.
Well, first, thanks, Ken, for having me on your show. And yeah, the idea behind No Miracles Needed is, well, first of all, we have these major problems we need to solve. I consider air pollution a major problem. There are almost 7.5 million people die every year from air pollution, and hundreds of millions, if not billions more, are ill. Global warming is a rising problem that is already causing humongous damage around the world. And energy insecurity is a looming problem as well. As fossil fuels run out, we need to replace them with something. So I've been working on trying to understand the problems for the last 35 years, and then in the last 20 years, trying to then solve the problems. The idea was always to try to understand the problems first and then to come up with solutions. And the solutions that I and others have developed are pretty basic and pretty much the obvious ones. Let's just electrify everything and provide that electricity from clean renewable sources. Now, there have been many people, though, who have either in the fossil fuel industry, in the nuclear industry, in the agricultural industries, that have been pushing alternative solutions to the climate problem. First of all, these people have not been focusing at all on air pollution or energy security. The only focus has been on climate. And their solutions include not only renewable energy, which is the obvious, but also let's include carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, electrofuels, bioenergy, small modular nuclear reactors, large reactors, geoengineering. These are all technologies that really, well, they do provide energy for the most part. They do not solve the climate problem. They do not solve the air pollution problem. They do not solve the energy security problems we face, and for a variety of reasons. The point of this book is really to point out, and with data, how we can solve all three problems with clean renewable energy and electrification, energy efficiency, electric appliances and machines, and why we do not need and we cannot afford to go down the path of these other technologies that are either sponsored, like those first four: carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, electrofuels. Those are all pushed by the fossil fuel industry. Bioenergy, of course, is pushed by the ag industry, and the nuclear is pushed by the nuclear industry. So, we need to listen to scientists, and there are hundreds of scientists that support the transition using clean renewable energy. That's really what this book is about, is to focus on clean renewable sources and why these other technologies don't work.
Yeah. And just to underscore, for each of the technologies and the politics underneath them that you just mentioned, your book deals with each one of them. And that's why, to me, it's so valuable. Sometimes I need a refresher on blue hydrogen. Sometimes I need a refresher on some aspect of the energy debate. It's encyclopedic, really, in its coverage. And there's no other resource like that I know of that comes from the direction of trying to clean up the air, deal with our carbon pollution problem, and do it in a way that's sustainable. So Greg and I, as I mentioned, we go way back in the day when you worked for Senator Harry Reid, and we were trying to raise concerns, basically stop the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste repository. And you went on from there to be a commissioner and then the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And that put you crossways with one of the most powerful industries in Washington. And just to touch again on what Mark said, there's a tendency for a bipartisan approach that's actually kind of awful when it comes to energy policy, which is Democrats and Republicans agree it should be everything. We should pursue everything. We should fund it all with taxpayer money, tax breaks, or direct grants. And that all of the above strategy, it's not really policy making, it's accommodation of political interests. And when you were at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, especially after Fukushima happened, and you were in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when that happened, you really went from being a skeptic to being deeply concerned about nuclear energy as a power source. And yet we're still at the federal level putting lots of money on the table to keep it going. Talk a little bit about what's the pressure like on a regulator, on a decision maker from these powerful industries?
Yeah, it's immense. One of the facets of regulation that I learned is ultimately how, I don't want to say powerless, but how weak in a way most regulators really are. The industries that they regulate far outnumber them. They far outspend them. The one authority that regulators have is some legal authority to enforce actions. But even those legal authorities are weaker than it may seem. And when you couple that with a Congress, in the case in particular of nuclear power, that is constantly pressuring the regulator to do less, it makes for a very challenging environment. And I would often visit nuclear power plants as part of my job. And I would go into a room and I'd usually have a few staff members that would travel with me. And I'd try and give an all hands meeting. So get as many of the plant employees into a room and just talk about issues and answer questions and hear from them about their concerns. And one of the points that I made at the very beginning was to look at the ratio of the amount of people from the NRC that were in the room relative to the amount of people from the industry that were in the room. And that ratio of my 3 or 4 staffers to the hundreds was about reflective of the overall strength of the industry versus the regulator. So I think there is a big misconception that these regulators are all powerful, they can do whatever they want, and you can, to the extent within the powers and the pressures of the Congress, of the budgets, of all of these factors that are heavily influencing it. I think, and as you said, the nuclear industry in particular right now is enjoying a period of tremendous support from all aspects, I think, of the political aisle, and I think that's making for some very bad policymaking.
Yeah, it has me concerned, and we can go back to it. But you mentioned in your book, which again, this is also essential reading to see what it's like to be inside this energy policy making process from someone who then tells the truth about it and is candid about it, which Greg does. Confessions of a rogue nuclear regulator. Tell us a little bit about where you were and what happened when the news from Fukushima reached you. What was that moment like? And then how did that affect your approach to being the lead nuclear regulator in the country?
I mean, certainly like everyone else, it caught us by surprise. I mean, nobody was expecting what transpired, even while we were in the middle of it. It's the hardest thing when you're dealing with a kind of an emergent crisis like this. These things happen in a way very slowly, but also very quickly. And you often don't have time to take a step back and realize what's happening. But certainly within the course of about a day, we realized that this earthquake, which is a devastating earthquake and tsunami in Japan, was now turning into a devastating nuclear power plant accident. And that accident would essentially go on for months. And one could even argue that it is going on to this day because there continues to be contaminated water that is produced that needs to be managed. And that is all a legacy of these reactors that had lost control of the nuclear radiation. And so today there continues to be contaminated water. There really, in a sense, the accident has just transitioned to a new phase. So that, we're talking now, it was 2011. So, we're talking over 10 years really since that happened. And you can't in a way say that it's over. And it won't be over until they clean up the plant, which could take several more decades. So that certainly had an impact on me. And as the head of the regulatory agency, I never really thought one or another, okay, is nuclear good or bad? It wasn't really my job. My job was to regulate it and do it in the way I thought was right. But after I left the agency, I began to think more about it. And, I think this touches on a lot of the work that Mark has done. But the saving grace for nuclear power is that it produces electricity without carbon emissions, which has an impact for air pollution. It has an impact for dealing with climate change. But what became clear to me, certainly once I left the industry, and as a result of a lot of good government policy, alternative carbon-free electricity sources and electricity generation techniques like battery storage and other energy storage techniques were becoming dramatically cheaper to the point that we didn't need a technology like nuclear power anymore with its challenges and its risks and its tremendous cost. And I think that is really where I started to recognize that there is a better way. And we don't have to deal with these kinds of challenges that a nuclear power plant can present.
I knew you were dealing with these challenges when you were commissioner, and then especially when you were, in charge of the NRC. There is literally no funding in the foundation community for taking a tough look at nuclear power, either looking at the existing plants, raising questions like Mark raises in his book, and you have raised as well, Greg. And I should mention you've assisted EWG on technical matters. But it's really the case that the scrutiny that's applied to this particular energy source, and I think it's true in some other areas as well, is not what we need. Now, Mark, you go through one after another of these it's the other side that's claiming the miracles, right? That we can clean up the air with carbon capture. We'll have modular nuclear reactors. We'll be spitting them out of a factory and plopping them down across the landscape. What do you think the key is to getting regular people to understand that we don't need miracles? We have almost everything we need right at hand. We just need to do something about it. Why aren't we just doing it?
Well, I should say we are doing it. It's just not as fast as we need to. And there are lots of pockets of amazing progress.
For sure.
California, for example, is putting a lot of not only new generation, mostly solar, but also some geothermal, some wind, some hydro, and also battery storage to a large degree. And it's last year it was 51% renewables on the grid. There are actually 11 states that are 50 to 90% of their consumption is met in the annual average with just wind, water, solar. And 7 of those 11 states are dominated by wind, not even hydro. And then one is California is dominated by solar, and the rest are dominated by hydro. And worldwide, there are like 5 countries that are 100% wind, water, solar in the annual average in terms of their electricity generation. And there are 45 countries that are between 50 and 100% wind, water, solar. So there is a growth in electricity, but there are 4 major sectors. There's electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry. And we're not as far along in these other sectors. Yeah. Now, there are about 30 million electric vehicles on the road worldwide, but that needs to ramp up. There are almost 1.5 billion vehicles in the world that we need to transition. So there's a lot that needs to be done. But on the other hand, if you then look at biggest emitter, which is China in the world, I mean, they put like 200 gigawatts of solar. They now exceed 500 gigawatts of solar. And well, in fact, their total renewables are close to a terawatt. And that's just a phenomenal growth in just a few years. Yeah. So good is going on. But the problem we're facing is, like in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, I mean, 60% of the funding is going for good things like wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric.
We supported it.
Yeah. Batteries, heat pumps, electric induction cooktops, energy efficiency, battery electric vehicles. But 40% is still going to these useless technologies such as carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, electrofuels, bioenergy of all kinds, and small modular nuclear reactors. And even there's a lot of support for existing large reactors, subsidies that are just going to keep these albatrosses alive while they could be replaced with clean renewable sources. You need to replace them in any case in a few years. So why are you just wasting subsidy money right now? On one hand, I'm very optimistic because we have the potential. I mean, we've done plans now for 149 countries, and we find that we can transition all these countries, and they represent like 99.75% of all world emissions. We can transition them, but we're not going as fast as we can, largely because there's a competition for solutions, and this competition is driven by lobbyists and not scientists.
Yeah, that's right. And those lobbyists have lots of money behind them. We hear so much about modular nuclear reactors, that this is going to be very different from the old large reactors. We've just brought one online. The one in Georgia was supposed to cost, 12, 14 billion. It ended up costing 34 billion. And it's many years overdue at that. The industry has said, well, we have a solution for that. We have these modular nuclear reactors are going to come off an assembly line. It's going to be a thing of beauty. Tell me a little bit about how that kind of lobbying campaign, to use Mark's term, and that's what it is, creates this incredible pressure to invest federal money, mostly taxpayer money. The nuclear industry wouldn't survive without it. What does that look like close up? How does that unfold and continue to block? It's a competition for solutions, right? And as long as they're blocking these solutions, it's going to make it harder for us to bring the good stuff online and scale up.
Yeah, the small modular reactors, or SMRs, is a really fascinating story in that regard. It actually started when I was chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and this is almost now 14 years ago. And the momentum was really a reflection of the recognition that large reactors, which were expected to be expensive and take a long time to build, not anywhere near as expensive and as long to build as they turned out to need. But there was a recognition that that's just never going to work, that you have to start trying to build them in pieces so that You can get them online more quickly. You don't have to borrow as much money and wait 5 years to begin generating revenue to pay off the debt that you borrow, all of which just compounds the expense of an already expensive technology. So the idea was, as you said, that these would be built in factories. And the sweetener for politicians and for policymakers was that this would create jobs in the United States. It would bring back manufacturing of nuclear components and nuclear technology, technologies which really in many ways were created in this country and are no longer produced in this country. So it's a very enticing message to policymakers to say, hey, we'll set up a factory and we'll, as you said, we'll start spitting these things out. Like, I think at the time when they were created, we still had iPods. It was the iPod era, not the iPhone era. We'd spit them out like iPods, and they would be easy. You just call up and say, hey, send me one, and it would show up the next day, and you'd plop it in and you'd start generating electricity. Of course, that's a fantasy, and it always was. And if we ever get to that scale, it will take building hundreds, if not thousands, of these reactors, which seems almost impossible today. So but that's where it starts. It starts with the industry pushing. It starts with talk of key buzzwords like climate change, air pollution, and then jobs. One of the biggest advantages you can talk to an elected official about is the job potential in your community, in your district. Wouldn't you love to have a manufacturing plant to build one of these? And there were companies that said they were going to build them. And again, this is 15 years ago, and none of those were ever built. So here we are again, 15 years later, and what I tell people is there's the expression, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And we are in the fool me twice stage with this technology. Everything that people are saying today about SMRs was said 15 years ago, and it led to absolutely nothing. But what's happened is you have a whole new generation of reporters, you have a whole new generation of congressional staffers, you have a whole new generation of Wall Street analysts, all of whom weren't involved in these issues 15 years ago. And then when they're told, hey, we have this brand new technology for you to consider, and it's going to solve all the problems, they think this is great. And then why can't it be done? Well, you got the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and all these people who just don't like nuclear power and are afraid of radiation. And so that's kind of how the messaging works. And you wind up spending, as Mark said, 40% of the Inflation Reduction Act on these kinds of industry support technologies and not climate change technology.
Yeah. And it's also of concern to me, at least, that there's sort of a reductionism going on here. We're so focused on carbon that theoretically nuclear looks great. And it's convenient then to forget that we have waste that comes out of these reactors that we then have to guard for, I don't know how many thousands of years. And we're so good at infrastructure in this country. You can imagine how well we'll guard these nuclear waste repositories, how excited politicians will be to spend money on that 1,000 years from now, even though they'll still have to. How do we get, as it were, an environmental perspective, which I find in your work comes right out, Mark? I mean, you talk about water issues, you talk about air pollution, you take a holistic approach, and I feel like sometimes that gets lost in the debates about climate change, where we have to rush and do big things fast and make compromises. Of course, this is the real world. These are sort of inevitable, but we do it in the service of whatever it takes to quickly reduce carbon emissions. But there's more to it. I may not want a transmission line from a solar farm coming through. I may want to be protective of that. I may not want a pipeline coming through because we need a short-term fix on natural gas. All of these questions that come up that you handle so well in your book and give people tools to talk through. But as you see this all unfolding, are we overly focused just on carbon?
Well, there is, but there's also kind of a lack of proper accounting for a lot of carbon. I mean, even when we talk about nuclear, I mean, doesn't emit carbon while the nuclear plant is running. But that's not the issue. The issue is what's the carbon over its whole life? And when you look at today in liberalized markets, it takes 17 to 21 years between planning and operation of a nuclear plant. And you have to compare that with how long it takes with a wind farm or solar farm, which is 1 to 3 years. And even rooftop solar, it's like 6 months. So there's only one pair of plants or reactors built in the United States in the last 20 years. The Vogtle plant that just came online recently in Georgia. And they took 17 to 18 years. There are two of them. Each one took 17, one took 18 years between planning and operation. They laid enough concrete for those plants for a sidewalk from Miami to Seattle. So they put up a huge amount of carbon while they're being constructed. But more importantly, if that money, that $35 billion, that's around $15.6 a watt. New wind or solar is like $1 a watt. And the levelized cost of energy, when you calculate the levelized cost of energy of that nuclear, it's about 5 to 8 times higher than that of new wind or solar. If you took that same $35 billion and you spent it on wind or solar, that could have been installed within even the maximum, let's say 5 years, instead of waiting 17 to 18 years between planning and operation. So while you're waiting around for that nuclear plant or those two reactors to be built, you're emitting carbon from coal plants, and this is in Georgia, coal, gas, wood, whatever being burned there for fuel. So you have a huge amount of emissions, this huge carbon debt that's been built up by this mistake of spending money on those nuclear reactors, in addition to all the carbon due to laying the concrete and all the energy that went into building the plant, all the workers driving there every day. So this will not pay its carbon debt off compared to if they'd invested in wind or solar ever. I mean, because every year, and not only that, it's like nuclear also requires uranium. So there's uranium mining, energy goes into that. There's refining the uranium, there's energy goes into that. There's water vapor emissions to cool the plant. And water vapor is a greenhouse gas that, even though it's much smaller, anthropogenic portion is much smaller than the natural portion, it's still about 2 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity equivalent. There's heat emissions from the nuclear plant. There's another 2.5 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. When we add up all the emissions from the time lag between planning and operation, from the mining and refining of uranium, from the water vapor and heat emissions, it's 9 to 37 times the CO2 equivalent emissions as wind per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, which is still lower than natural gas, but it's still much higher than wind or solar. So it's not carbon free when you look at it over its whole life and all its impacts. And on top of that, it's just delayed. So, if we want a new nuclear reactor starting today, we're saying we're going to plan a new nuclear reactor, it's taking 17 to 21 years. So this is 2024. 17 years from now is 2041. We need to solve 80% of the climate problem by 2030. Okay, so if we have a technology that won't even be ready till 2041 at least, it is completely useless. There is no hope any new nuclear is helpful one bit for climate, let alone air pollution, energy security, or anything. It's completely useless. It only lines the pockets of those pushing nuclear. And it's just amazing how there's so many plants, like in Europe, there's Hinkley, that's also going to be 20 years. There's Flamanville, France. France hasn't built a new nuclear reactor in 20 years either. And the only one that they're building, it's taken 20 years from planning to operation. It's delayed over cost overruns. Olkiluoto 3 in Finland, that took 21 years. And there's no plant in the world that's ever been less than 10 years between planning and operation. And these days, even in the fastest place, there's some reactors being built in China, they take 12, 13, 14 years still. And it's just, they're too slow. They're useless for helping solve these problems.
Yeah. Again, this is why you need his book, because he goes through all of this chapter and verse for each technology. And Greg, I think for most people who are outside these debates, maybe read about it, maybe even get engaged, through some form of advocacy. But I think to understand the real power politics of it, they have to read your book and understand that even after these tremendous near misses or actual problems, like the Davis-Besse disaster that almost befell us in Ohio, and of course, Fukushima, there's still these powerful political forces that it's about jobs, as you say. Their union jobs really divides Democrats in some very important ways, who want to be supportive of labor unions on the one hand, and on the other are worried about nuclear. But these are high-paying jobs. It seems like we have to spend $1 billion just to get a first set of plans with nuclear, but that doesn't seem to dissuade anybody from putting that first billion and second and third billion down, and so on and so forth. How do we shake up the debate and get people to focus on some of the points that you've been making and Mark just made?
Well, it's hard. There is a tremendously successful marketing campaign right now that the nuclear industry has undertaken, and it's been years in the making. It didn't just start last year. They've been laying the foundation for certainly a decade at least. And it's, there's now a lot of catch up to do to dispel the myth, to bring out the facts. And when you do that, I think the people recognize that this really is more about a money grab than it is about actually addressing our pending energy and climate and environmental challenges. There are real, as you said, so we lose focus a little bit on the environment when we talk about climate. And, I teach policy classes. And one of the examples I always say is that, in 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years from now, our challenge is going to be water pollution issues with, the use of perhaps, new technologies and what impacts they may have, because we never think of products in the full life cycle and environmental impact that they may have. And again, a lot of the work that Mark has done is to really highlight the full life cycle impacts of these technologies. And so when you start to talk about nuclear and its full life cycle impact and the legacy of waste, the long-term, millennial impact that nuclear waste has, it creates a different dimension to the technology. And it undercuts this notion that these are climate solutions, because again, that's really the only positive talking point you have for nuclear today is that it's the nuclear industry has jumped onto the climate change bandwagon and made promises, most of which they'll never keep. But by the point that they fail to keep them, it will be too late. And I think that's why it's so important right now to raise these issues. It was fascinating at COP28, one of the great pronouncements that came out of it was a commitment, I think, to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. Which on its face sounds great, but then if you realize in 2050 we're supposed to be at, essentially net zero carbon globally in all sectors, and if we're going to condition that on nuclear tripling, that's just a fantasy, and it's a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe for failing to address climate change. So it is hard right now. The resources are not there. The kind of political, industrial think tank world has been told a story that's not true, largely about nuclear technology. And so it's going to take work. It's going to take, both at the grassroots level and kind of in the intelligentsia level of addressing and getting people to see what the facts are and continuing to work through it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, we're really at an exciting period when it comes to taking on these issues, because for all my years coming up as an environmentalist, we were just opposed to things in the energy sector mostly, right? Yeah. But now the things that we're for are as important as the things we're against. And that's a change for environmentalists. We have a lot of positive developments that we need to build on that are being blocked, in a sense, by some of these older technologies, this older thinking, the accommodation of all of the above energy policy, which for all its strengths, the Inflation Reduction Act was another example of. Let's just throw money at everything, make everyone a little bit happy, make everyone a little bit unhappy. That's the recipe for a successful political compromise. And what we end up with is one foot on the brake and one foot on the gas at the same time. We need to escape that. And now to be able to talk about the positive things, it really does turn the debate on its head, because we can say, and Mark can recite it chapter and verse, country by country, state by state. I know the progress that we've made. We just need to accelerate it more. We need to overcome these political obstacles. And we certainly need to be telling people straight what we really have at hand. And that leads me to one final question, which is, I'm very concerned that for all its strong points, that the Inflation Reduction Act is literally shifting too much power to some centralized sources of wealth and control, like electric utilities, major automakers, and so forth. We need changes in all those sectors, without question. But we're handing these resources, these taxpayer funds, tax breaks, and so forth, handing them over in a way that I worry the utilities are going to have even more control. They're snuffing out rooftop solar wherever they can for the sake of power sources, including renewable sources that they have more control over. In some cases, we're looking at the auto industry as, struggling, although EVs are doing extremely well. But there's still a reluctance, I think, in some quarters, certainly at the dealership level, to embrace this new technology. How do you feel about the importance of working with in the existing power structure versus using this opportunity to at least challenge it a little bit, at least with respect to, say, electric utilities? What's your sense of that?
Well, if I look at the big picture, my bigger concern is the funding of 40% of the Inflation Reduction Act to the fossil fuel industry, to the nuclear industry, and to the ag industry for useless technologies.
Yeah.
So for the remaining 60%, the concern you mentioned, which is a valid concern, is that you might be giving too much to utilities and automakers. Now, to the extent that they are using that money to actually, in the case of utilities, to convert gas to electricity, like my utility, PG&E, they do want to convert more of their gas to electricity because they spend a lot of money just maintaining pipelines due to the San Bruno gas explosion, and in
Sure.
California there was the Aliso Canyon gas blowout, for example. They want to shed gas if they could, so electrifying as much as possible and then providing the electricity with clean renewable energy. Now, if they're doing that, that's great. No, hopefully not at the expense of rooftop solar, which of course they have tried to kill, and they've successfully suppressed quite a bit in California. And similarly with automobile companies, if they're using the money to electrify their fleets, to go to electric vehicles, that's great. But I can imagine they're claiming credits and then they're shifting a lot of that money internally to fossil fuel vehicles. So there's a concern. That concern I have, but it's a lesser concern than the money going straight to the fossil fuel industry.
Of course.
for carbon capture, the whole idea of carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, electrofuels, these constructs are designed entirely to keep the fossil fuel industry alive. They do not do anything for air pollution or climate. They make air pollution worse. They actually increase carbon dioxide, and it's very straightforward why they increase carbon dioxide. Carbon capture and direct air capture, for example, both require energy. And it's like there's an energy penalty that's huge. It's like if you add carbon capture to a coal plant, 25% of the electricity generated by that coal plant needs to run the carbon capture equipment. That's a huge energy penalty. It means you need 25% more coal. They're saying, well, let's use renewable electricity to run the carbon capture. That solves that problem. No, it doesn't solve that problem because there's a limited amount of renewable electricity. And if you're using a huge amount of renewable electricity to run carbon capture or direct air capture, you're preventing that renewable electricity from actually replacing the coal plant or gas plant and its air pollution and its mining and its infrastructure. And because the same amount of renewable electricity replacing the coal plant or a gas plant reduces more CO2 than that same amount of renewable electricity running carbon capture for the coal plant or direct air capture, you're increasing CO2 by using renewable electricity to run carbon capture or direct air capture. So those processes, direct air capture, carbon capture, only increase CO2. They do not decrease it. They increase CO2. They increase air pollution. They increase fossil mining. They increase fossil infrastructure. And they keep the fossil fuel industry alive. And they cost consumers money because it's just a tax on mostly poor people.
Yeah.
Because who pays the highest fraction of their income for electricity? It's low-income people.
Sure.
And this is where the money that is used for carbon capture, direct air capture, that's who pays for it. It's ratepayers. So this is my biggest concern is most people are not aware of what these technologies are or what their implications are. And politicians they just go and jump on a bandwagon and they hear this buzzword and then they vote for it. And maybe some of them are in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry as well. So that's my bigger concern.
Yeah, I think the Inflation Reduction Act was monumental policymaking. It was by no means the most effective way to address climate change. I think the answers to that, as a former regulator, you look at these problems simply. If you want to reduce carbon emissions, then you pass laws and regulations that reduce carbon emissions. Obviously, that's a non-starter right now in this country. So the best alternative was to provide a massive amount of incentives, and you provide that to everyone so that you can get the votes to pass a bill. So that, there's the realpolitik element to it that is ugly and messy, but hopefully it gives enough money to the good technologies that they will just win the race. Unfortunately, it does it in a very wasteful manner because you are spending a lot of money on technologies that have no real, as Mark said, goal to actually combat climate change, but really have goals to preserve their industries. And the federal government is happy to oblige. But at the end of the day, those technologies have to go away. And I think, the best approach to that would have been something that, says, for instance, we're going to phase out use of natural gas in 20 years. We're going to stop the use of coal in 10 years. So, certainly the latter is happening on its own in the market. gas is certainly not going away fast enough. And so if you really wanted to address these issues from a policy perspective, that's how you would have to do it. But unfortunately, the country isn't there to do that. So the next best solution is just to give gobs of money.
Big old pile of money.
And I'll say too, it's often forgotten. You talked about the electric utilities, the car, industry, all the people getting this money. But at the end of the day, the bulk of these incentives are tax credits. Somebody needs to benefit. Essentially, you have to have an exchange of dollars for tax credits. So if you're building a new solar project, you have those tax credits, which you may not generate enough revenue from your solar project that those tax credits are actually worthwhile to you. But they could be worthwhile to an individual or a corporation that does renewable work that wants to reduce its tax burden. And so they exchange money for you for the tax credits. And in the process of doing that, there's an entire cottage industry, well, not cottage industry, but massive industry of lawyers, bankers, who are siphoning off a portion of that money as fees on that transaction. So, there is this massive kind of transition of capital away from the goal of this, which is actually, to build renewables, to build battery storage, to these secondary industries, these service industries that are doing very, very well as a result of, these billions and billions of dollars in tax credits.
Yeah.
It's not a simple one-for-one transaction, and there's legal elements to it. And to a certain extent, they tried to simplify some of it. But nonetheless, if you want to get cash value for those tax credits, you got to hire a bunch of lawyers who take, 10% or something of what that credit is worth, and they pocket that as a fee. So that's 10% of that money that's not going to actual renewable deployment. So, there are a lot of problems with it, but, unfortunately, I think paraphrase, was Donald Rumsfeld, you go to fight climate change with the tools you have, not, I think, with the laws that you wish you had. And I think that's where we are. And it's certainly better than nothing. It's certainly not optimal.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. If you're an environmentalist working these days, there's a way in which you can legitimately say that while we still have to oppose some of these old technologies and help push them out of the way, we have things to fight for now that were really kind of unicorns maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago. The changes that have happened in battery storage, solar, wind, all the technologies. Mark goes through all of them in his book. And so that positive energy is literally, I think, the future of environmentalism, making sure those come to reality. And in the course of doing that, we're going to have to make sure that everyone understands the downsides of these old technologies. So thank you both. I'm going to plug your books one more time. Mark Jacobson, No Miracles Needed. Please, if you're listening or watching this, buy his book, because it will become your Bible for understanding a lot of these energy policy debates. And if you want to understand, which I hope you will understand, the realpolitik, as Greg said, of what it's like to be in the inside of energy policymaking at the highest level, get Greg's book, Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. This is the guy that broke bad against the nuclear industry. They tried to stop him at every step of the way, but he stood up to them and raised these questions throughout his time as a commissioner and as chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we have the architect and we have the rogue insider. Thank you for giving us your time today. I think it's an invaluable set of lessons for everyone to take away and have a fresh understanding of the energy debate that we're in the middle of right now. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Ken.
Appreciate your work. Thank you both for coming on the show, and thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links to take a deeper dive into today's discussion, and don't forget their books. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if you like this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they're at. And if you're listening to this, you probably know someone else who might be interested in today's episode. They just don't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby. Thanks again for listening.